All right, so this is the second part of my six-part series on introducing the military to civilians and anybody who's interested. In the first part, I talked about becoming a soldier and entering the military. In this part, I'm going to talk about the organization of the total force, the military, the service member community. When I say military, I include both the total force, service members, as well as the veteran community. I'll get to that more later. But right now, this is the second part of six where I'm going to be talking about the organization of the total force and all the different armed service branches. There's 12 of them. You can see them listed here. There's the Air Force, Air National Guard, Army National Guard, all of these fun little colors. There are 12 branches, and you cannot serve concurrently in more than one. You might think there's four: Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force. There's actually 12 with the reserve units and National Guard units. These are distinct branches that you cannot serve in two at one time. So there's 12, not four, maybe if you count five for the Space Force. Now there are active duty branches: Air Force, Army, Coast Guard, Navy, Marine Corps. I spent 6 years in the United States Army. And when service members say United States Army, they don't mean the reserves, they don't mean the National Guard. They will say that. I spent 6 years on active duty. I also spent 2 years in inactive status, which I'll talk about later in another slide. But these are distinguishable terms, and we shouldn't confuse them. There are also active status reserves, where you are actively under a contract, but you might only report 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year. There's also, in these active status reserves, active duty reserve personnel who man the phones or come into work every day and unlock the door. So they are reservists, but they work 24/7 or whatever, 40-hour work week. And that includes all the regular reserves: Marine, Coast Guard, Navy, Army, Air Force reserves, as well as the Air and Army National Guard, which there are 52 of each, I think, with Puerto Rico and something else. So in peacetime, this is how the total force is organized. You can see that the Air Force and Air Force Reserve have their own thing, then the Army, Army Reserves, and then the Navy actually includes the Marine Corps and its reserves. Homeland Security during peacetime is responsible for the Coast Guard and Coast Guard Reserve. That's relatively new, I think, in the 80s. It went from outside the Department of Defense, went to the Department of Homeland Security in its creation, in the early 2000s. And then each state or territory has its own Air National Guard and Army National Guard. So that's something like 108, I think, plus the different reserves and federal branches. It's actually quite complicated. Then in wartime, everything gets drawn under the Department of Defense. Homeland Security loses the Coast Guard, which then gets brought under defense, kind of accompanying the Navy. And then we have the Air and Army National Guard falling under Air Force and Army, respectively. Then we have this gray area called the Individual Ready Reserve. Every single person who signs a contract with the United States military service branches, everybody signs up for 8 years. Now, you only may do 2 years on active duty or 4 years on a reserve status, but you are going to owe 6 years or 4 years, depending on what your time is left. From the day you sign your contract, you have an 8-year military service obligation, or MSO. When I signed up in February of 2000, I didn't ship out to active duty until August. But beginning when I signed my contract, I became a service member. I was simply on inactive reserve status until I went active. So my military service obligation did not end when I was discharged in November of 2006. My MSO expired February of 2008, a couple years after I finally got out. So it's an important distinction to remember. If you're going to sign up, you're signing up for 8 years, regardless of the different statuses. So the last slides in this presentation go over the legal purpose and function of each branch, or in the Army and Air Force case, there are two different sections, but the Air Force was born out of the Army Air Corps in the 40s, and so they share almost identical language, even if they're in separate parts of the United States legal code. In the Air Force, it's all of them are Title 10, but this one's 8062, and then the Army is 3062. You can pause and read those if you like. The Navy is in 5062, and you can tell these are all kind of a piece. And the Marines are in 5062 as well. They're underneath the Navy. They get all their money from the Navy. And then finally, the Coast Guard is also in 5062. And I put these out there, and I'll go back. You can pause to read the Army, for example. If you read their legal purpose, their first one is not actually waging war. That doesn't come in until the fourth and final legal purpose and function of the military, of overcoming nations responsible for aggressive acts that imperil American peace and security. So their first function is preserving peace and security, providing for the defense of states, possessions, areas occupied by the United States. And it varies with each branch. Again, you can pause and read these if you like. But the purpose of our military is not to wage wars and go off and pull triggers and drop bombs. That is within their purview, but their first and primary function is defense of our interests, etc. And that might be splitting hairs, but it's a hair I think that's important because a lot of civilians have this idea, again, that the military is homogenous and all it does is go off and shoot stuff and blow stuff up. And that is a lot of what it does, but if it's acting outside its primary function, I think that's morally significant, that we don't just assume that all soldiers kill, not only because most specialties don't use their weapons, and a lot of, even within combat arms, if you gain enough rank, you're not going to be doing a whole lot of conventional fighting, but that the military is diverse. It's made of a bunch of different people, and what they're expected to do, their primary function is almost never killing and destroying things. And so I hope that's one of the most important takeaways that I'm hoping will come across in these presentations.